In this presentation, the topic of complex responsive processes and how it can be viewed as an alternative way to think about organizational strategy will be discussed. Initially, the dominant discourse of strategic management and complex responsive processes will be defined, and the fundamental differences between them discussed. These differences, such as how the dominant discourse expresses strategy through simplified abstractions and that the future is known, versus complex responsive processes, which has a more short-term focus and outlook, and that the strategy of the organization evolves due to the interactions of its members. Further insight of these differences between the two views and how complex responsive processes is viewed as an alternative to think about organizational strategy will be given through practical examples based on the current environment organizations find themselves in. And lastly, recommendations will be given and a conclusion drawn on how complex responsive processes can be seen as a viable alternative to think about organizational strategy.
In the dominant discourse view, we use the term traditional view here, which encompasses strategic choice, learning organization, and knowledge management to illustrate how complex responsive processes provides an alternative the way of thinking about organizational strategy. So in the traditional view, we think of managers as an objective observer, which means thinking of them as though they are external from the organization. The manager then can view the organization as a system and as a whole, which can be controlled. The manager additionally views the people which make up the system as autonomous individuals and as objects which can also be controlled. There is an underlying ideology of control here. In the alternative view presented by complex responsive processes, we view people in the organization as subjective and as objects that participate and act locally. Viewing the organization not as a system or whole, but as a social object. The system as a whole is an ideological construct in this view. Rather than viewing people as autonomous individuals, they are viewed as interdependent. The complex responsive processes view argues that independence and autonomy are fictitious because human beings are fundamentally interdependent, meaning the individual self is social and is formed in social interaction.
With this mentioned, we can now identify how the traditional view and alternative view functions within the context of organizational strategy. Through a traditional view, managers are able to take a position that falls outside the organization and can objectively view the organization as a whole. Through the traditional view that individuals are autonomous objects, management views the employees as being autonomous objects that only serve towards executing strategies proposed by management. As this is the perception, management believes that they have the power to exert full control over the behavior and actions of employees. If this was indeed the case, this justifies how management believes that employee behavior, the future, and the outcome of a strategy is predictable. In the traditional view, the process of strategy refers to the administrative systems and decision-making procedures managers use to formulate and implement strategy content. With this mentioned, strategy is expressed as simplified abstractions, visions, missions, and plans. As management views the organization as a whole, they believe that any proposed strategy will be implemented and executed throughout the entire organization, which focuses on what managers should do. The alternative view takes a different approach towards viewing organizational strategy. This view is concerned with what managers are doing, not what they should be doing. Through the alternative view, managers are not able to take an objective position outside the organization, but rather takes a place as an individual forming part and functioning within the organization. The managers interact with one another and employees within the organization locally. As individuals are viewed as interdependent and diverse, individuals respond differently towards interactions. With this mentioned, management can thus interact within the company and with employees, but cannot control the outcome or responses of these interactions. From the alternative view, the process of strategy refers to the fundamental process of human interaction, namely communicative interaction between interdependent individuals within the organization, taking the form of the conversation of gestures. So strategy is an evolution of what people do and what they become. As people evolve through their interactions and the outcomes of these interactions are uncontrollable, strategy is not pre-planned and implemented, but emergent through the local interactions. Therefore, strategy and its outcome is unpredictable, as it is not pre-planned or fully under control, but emergent from interdependent interactions locally that thrives on diversity.
Practical examples. Firstly, we'll be talking in terms of the dominant discourse. We need to understand the context in terms of how these examples are created. The management structure in the dominant discourse is viewed as having quite a rigid and hierarchical power structure. This means that top management, such as the board and CEOs, have significant amount of power to plan and control their business activities. This is seen and is emphasized as management is involved in the decision making, making the organization centralized in its nature. The practical examples that management does in order to obtain and achieve organizational strategy under the dominant discourse are things such as long-term planning. This is an assumption that management accepts that the future is obtainable and plannable. Thus, management does this activity in order to achieve a desired future state. Another activity done by management to achieve organizational strategy is the use of tools and techniques of management. It is believed that through the following of these models, management will be able to achieve a desirable outcome that is controllable and planned subsequently from the use of these tools and techniques and models. Complex responsive systems. Complex responsive systems oppose these examples. The practical activities observed in this system are things such as management's role in the organization is vastly different to the dominant discourse. This is done by the occurrence of management being actively involved in the business, thus being a participant in the system. This is achieved through management's role through evolving communication and interaction with employees.
In conclusion, we begin to see how complex responsive processes can be seen as an alternative view or way of thinking when we compare complex responsive processes to the traditional view where dominant discourses are evident. On the one hand, the dominant discourse and its approach to organizational strategy relies upon assumptions that management has control over the behavior and responses of employees as they are perceived to be mere objects used towards achieving management's strategic outcome. On the other hand, complex responsive processes moves away from relying on prescriptions and resorts to understanding how the local interactions and responses between individuals are unpredictable and therefore disapproves of a planned strategy and turns to an emerging strategy. As we reflect on our current situation with regards to the coronavirus and the pandemic, we can clearly see that many organization strategies have been based on market conditions that no longer exist and is therefore unachievable. This has resulted in many organizations as well as individuals having to relook at their desired outcomes and goals for both the short and long term, which is aligned to the emergence of the new normal that we know now. In light of the traditional view, with the dominant discourse being evident, the future as we know it would be considered to be known and predictable, whereas in complex responsive processes, the long-term future is unpredictable and the short-term future is relatively predictable. However, the element of uncertainty is still evident. The new normal that we know now displays characteristics or market conditions of both uncertainty and unpredictability, and this highlights how complex responsive processes is an alternative view and way of thinking about organizational strategy.
We recommend that managers use the view of complex responsive processes to bring human beings back into organizational strategy. We recommend that managers reflect on the way that they participate in the emergence of the strategy through interactions, and do further reflection on their use of language in their strategy formulation and their interactions. Lastly, we recommend that managers should allow for possible strategies to be consulted across the population in the organization so that patterns of interpretation of the strategy can become the norm.